July 3, 1941. Barely 10 days after the largest military operation in history began, General Halder wrote in his diary that it was no exaggeration to say that the Red Army had already been largely defeated, and that it was to be expected for the Soviet Union to surrender in the next few days. However, a month later on August 11th, Halder, whose position was Chief of Staff of the High Command of the German Army, stated the following. Regarding the general situation, it is increasingly clear that we have underestimated the Russian colossus. At the beginning of the war we had calculated that the Red Army had a total of about 200 divisions. We have now identified more than 360. These divisions are not armed and equipped in a similar way to ours, and tactically they are very poorly led. But in any case, those divisions are there, and when we destroy a dozen of them, another 12 instantly appear in their place. The Soviets are favored by the time factor, since they are close to their own centers of power and production, while we are getting further and further away from ours. As we see, the difference between one message and another is abysmal. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what happened during that month of July 1941? Well, that is exactly what we are going to see next. On June 22, 1941, the German Center Army Group began its advance towards Moscow, its capture being the most important objective of Operation Barbarossa. The first days of the offensives were filled with great victories, including the capture of Minsk in the first days of July, inflicting more than 300,000 casualties on the Red Army. After this, the next step towards Moscow passed through the city of Smolensko, which was another central axis of communications. In addition, once this city was taken, the German army would already be located some 350 kilometers from Moscow, thus being within reach of the next operation. As we have seen in Halder's first entry, after having heavily defeated the hundreds of Soviet divisions near the border, the Germans hoped that from now on this advance would be less costly. However, as we are going to see, this was not the case. The German strategy to take Smolensk was to carry out a pincer attack on the city, in which Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army would advance from the north, and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army would advance from the south. Both armies were made up of 3 panzer and 3 motorized divisions, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army being slightly superior to Hoth's. In addition to these German attack formations, we must add more than a dozen infantry divisions. In total, some 400,000 men with 1,000 tanks. On the other hand, we have the Red Army, which despite having already suffered millions of casualties, was reorganizing at full speed, and was sending everything it had into combat. In total, Timoshenko was able to fight with 13 armies, including those that had been retreating from Minsk, and those that came as reinforcements from the rear. Among all of them, there were about 550,000 soldiers with 1,500 tanks. The battle began on July 10th with a simultaneous attack by the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Armies. 3rd Panzer Army charged northeast to reach north of Smolensko, and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army charged east to be south of the city. Both attacks managed to break through at full speed, easily overcoming the weak Soviet defenses. This was due to the fact that most of the armies that Timoshenko was going to count on were still arriving in the area, and the units that withstood the German onslaught were those that were already crushed after hard fighting. This attack was made almost exclusively with the panzer divisions, since most of the infantry divisions had not yet arrived. The truth was that during the previous weeks, the advance of the panzers had been so rapid that the infantry had not been able to keep up on foot, and had fallen far behind. Heinrich himself, who years later was in charge of defending the Silo Hills, also participated in this battle, and on July 8 he noted the following. Now we are very behind with respect to the motorized divisions. We march between 30 and 35 kilometers a day, and although the horses have a lot of difficulty making their way on the sandy roads, we must continue on. Later on July 11th, with the Battle of Smolensko in full swing, Heinrich wrote the following again. Yesterday, one regiment marched 54 kilometers on foot, and another 47. Doing it once is possible, but doing it after having made numerous marches of between 30 and 40 kilometers is a tremendous thing. To achieve this, no one sleeps at night. They set out at 2 or 3 in the morning, and continue walking until it gets dark again at 10. Thus, and as we can see, both the German infantry and the Soviet reinforcements arrived in the vicinity of Smolensko once the attack had already begun. This first attack by the panzers had resulted in 2 penetrations to the east and northeast, leaving 4 Soviet armies in a large salient west of Smolensk. Further south, the Germans also launched another attack that ended up pinning 2 Soviet armies near Mogilev. Once the gap was open, the panzer divisions had to continue advancing, while the infantry that was still arriving on the battlefield established itself on the perimeters of the encirclements. However, their arrival was delayed for a few days, and this meant that the panzers could not advance as fast as they wanted. In any case, on the 12th and 13th the offensives resumed, and the city of Smolensko was practically surrounded, having only a small corridor in the northeast. This moment was also taken advantage of by the Soviet reinforcements, which began to arrive in the area and established themselves on the banks of the Vop River in the north, and further down in the southwest of Yelnia. In total, about 5 large Soviet armies were established east of Smolensko, with about 50,000 soldiers each. During the days of July 15th and 16th, the situation was quite chaotic on the German front, where there were a multitude of units fighting in isolation and with very little cohesion. Thus, and while the infantry was arriving little by little, the panzer and motorized divisions continued to attack the Soviets, hoping to finish breaking their defenses and their will to continue resisting. This attack was directed in the north against the banks of the Vop River, and in the south of Smolensko it was directed against the city itself, and against Rokossovsky's army that was located to the east of the city. This German attack managed to make some progress, but it had less and less momentum, and Smolensk was still not completely surrounded. In addition, the Soviet resistance in the east of Smolensko was increasing. Between the 16th and 19th, most of the German infantry divisions finally began to reach the outskirts of the city, and after dealing with 2 isolated Soviet armies southwest of Smolensko, began to shore up the front line. This moment coincided with a strong Soviet counterattack, which was carried out by all the armies that had concentrated in the east of the Vop River. This attack could be contained by the Germans, and contributed to the formation of a solid front line in the vicinity of Smolensko in the shape of a capital S. While these combats were taking place, on July 16th, Hitler issued Directive 31, this being one of the most important of the entire war. It stated that after taking Smolensko, Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army had to turn north to support the capture of Leningrad, and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army had to go south to participate in the future Great Battle of Kyiv. These were undoubtedly very tense moments for Guderian, Hoth, and von Bock, who did not want to deviate from their course towards Moscow. In any case, the battle for Smolensko continued on the 20th, 21st and 22nd, with a series of Soviet counterattacks along the entire front line, without achieving any break. It should be noted that most of these troops had been mobilized at full speed, and had very little combat value. The Germans for their part continued to press on during the following days, until by July 27 they were finally able to completely encircle Smolensko, and they also continued advancing eastward, also capturing the city of Yelnia. After a few attempts by Rokossovsky to rescue the encircled troops, it all ended on August 5, when the Soviet garrison in Smolensko surrendered. The losses in this battle were very high for both sides, the Red Army suffering close to 450,000 casualties between dead, wounded and prisoners, while the German side had about 100,000. However, the heavy fighting in this sector was far from over, and soon the terrible Battle of Yelnia would begin, with even worse results. Although it will be a battle that we will see soon, let's now analyze the consequences of this tough battle for Smolensko. First of all, it made clear to the Germans the great capacity that the Red Army had to recover from all its losses, and to return to launch great counterattacks. This made it clear that it was difficult to produce that great quick and resounding victory in the Soviet Union. On the other hand, it was at this moment that the decision was made not to continue advancing towards Moscow, and to divide the units of Army Group Center, to participate in operations that had the objective of capturing hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Soviets, which ultimately would not be enough to cause the collapse of the Red Army. So, and before the end of the program, we want to highlight another phrase from Heinrich dated August 3rd, this being the moment of the end of this battle. In it we are going to see how the tone begins to be more desperate, and victory looks further and further away. When enemy units are destroyed, the Soviets send new troops to the front and attack again. How the Russians get it is beyond my knowledge. In the meantime, we barely received a replacement. Sometimes we wonder what winter has in store for us. We will most certainly have to remain here in Russia. So we will have to endure a positional war along a huge front. What a wonderful prospect. August 5, 1941. After almost a month of hard fighting in the vicinity of Smolensko, in which Army Group Center lost the momentum of the previous weeks, the last Soviet defenders inside the city surrender. As we saw a few days ago when we analyzed this battle, this time it was seen how the infantry divisions had not been able to keep up with the panzer divisions, and the battle had to start hastily. In addition, the Germans realized that the Soviet resistance was going to be much stronger than expected, and after reaching Smolensk, they still had a long and hard road ahead until they reached Moscow. It was also during these days that it was decided that Army Group Center was going to be divided, to support the capture of Leningrad in the north, and Kyiv in the south. Thus, the German forces in the sector were weakened, and they waited to be reinforced again to continue their assault on Moscow. During the fighting for the capture of Smolensk, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army also advanced to the east, and captured the city of Yelnia during the last days of July. This position was situated on high ground, and would serve as the starting point for the further advance towards Moscow, so Guderian decided to take it at that time when Soviet resistance was relatively weak. This generated a small bulge on the German front, which was going to be the center of the next fighting, without the bulk of the German Center Army Group being there to respond effectively to the Soviet attacks. What we are going to see next is the first successful counteroffensive of the Red Army against the Germans, which set off all the alarms in the German High Command, because it made clear the great capacity that the Soviet army still had after having suffered great defeats. With that said, let's start looking at what exactly happened at Yelnia during August and September of 1941. Although Yelnia had been captured by the 10th Panzer Division, Das Reich, and the 268th Infantry Division, these divisions were later sent to the rear to rest, and were replaced by 2 German infantry divisions. Approximately, this semicircular perimeter had about 70 kilometers in front, so each German infantry division had to protect a 23-kilometer line. The 78th Division would cover the north, the 292nd the east, and the 268th Division was established in the south of the salient. In addition, and to prevent the salient from being encircled by the Soviets, the 15th Infantry Division was in charge of defending the northern entrance to the salient, and the 7th Infantry Division defended the southern entrance. In total, it is estimated that these 5 divisions had about 70,000 troops, supported by 500 artillery pieces and 40 Stugs 3. On the other hand, the Soviets were sending reinforcements to the vicinity of Yelnia and Smolensko at full speed, in an attempt to stop the German advance once and for all. For this, Zhukov himself took charge of the situation, and in this sector he could count on the presence of 3 Soviet armies, with about 10 divisions in total. The 24th Army was located in the north of Yelnia, while the 43rd was located in the south. These Soviet divisions are estimated to have numbered about 100,000 troops, along with 800 artillery guns and 150 main battle tanks. In a similar way to what would happen a few months later in the Rzhev salient, the Soviets began a series of periodic attacks, which little by little wore down the Germans. The first of these offensives took place during the first week of August, and was a failure for the attacking Soviet forces, as it was launched hastily. Thus, in less than 48 hours this assault had to be called off. This failure did not stop the Soviets, who a few days later, already in mid-August, continued to launch attacks along the entire salient. The German defensive capacity during the first days was quite good, but due to the intensity of the fighting, and the artillery bombardment that the Soviets were launching on them, they began to have very high casualties. This progressively caused his capacity for resistance to gradually decrease throughout the entire month of August, in which increasingly intense fighting took place. By this time, the bulk of the German forces were fighting Kyiv, and the central sector of the Eastern Front had receded into the background for the Germans. Thus, this situation was taken advantage of by the Soviets, who decided to continue sending troops to this sector, to start another powerful offensive on August 30th. On this occasion, the attack would take place right at the base of the salient, and its objective would be to encircle the 3 German infantry divisions that were inside it. It is possible that the best thing for the Soviets at the time would have been to direct their resources into establishing better defensive positions, but Stalin was ordering widespread counterattacks all along the front. Thus, these attacks were carried out by troops that had just been mobilized for combat, and who intended to replace the millions of Soviet soldiers who had been killed in the first weeks of the confrontation. While to date the Germans had been able to fend off these desperate counterattacks, this time, and for the first time in the entire war, it was going to be different. On August 30th, numerous Soviet divisions attacked the German salient right at its base, and achieved a penetration of 4 kilometers in the north, and 2 in the south. This endangered the 3 German divisions that are in the vicinity of Yelnia, and will cause the withdrawal order. As always happened in this type of situation, when Hitler is informed of this event, his reaction is to order them to resist in the salient positions. However, 3 days later, the situation had deteriorated greatly, and he had no choice but to authorize von Bock to evict the Yelnia salient. This German withdrawal began on September 3rd, and ended on the 7th, establishing a new straight defensive line about 10 kilometers west of Yelnia. As we can imagine, the Soviet propaganda made use of this event and sold it as a great defeat of the German invader, stating that many German divisions had been encircled and annihilated. Although this was not exactly the case, since the Germans were able to withdraw in a more or less orderly manner, the truth is that they suffered enormous losses in the fighting in the vicinity of Yelnia that took place for a month, losing a total of 23,000 troops. For their part, the Soviets had casualties of around 30,000 combatants. It should be noted that the casualty ratio in the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa had been 25-1, and now for the first time they were practically equal. Thus, this Soviet victory served to raise the morale of the Red Army, and this was the moment when the famous Guard divisions began to be created, which was a recognition given to those divisions that had performed well in combat. In any case, the celebration did not last long, because 2 weeks later there was the great German victory in Kyiv, in which more than 650,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. In addition, once Kyiv fell, Army Group Center regained its leading role, and began to prepare to assault Moscow. September 30th, 1941. 3 months after the start of Operation Barbarossa, with which Germany intended to defeat the Soviet Union in a few weeks, the Wehrmacht is still far from achieving its objective. It is specifically on this date of September 30th, when they managed to regroup and launch their final offensive in the direction of Moscow, with winter just around the corner. If they manage to capture the Soviet capital, they may well be able to defeat Stalin and end the war. If they fail, I know they will be left in a very vulnerable situation in the dead of winter, and will give the Soviets oxygen until the following summer. Thus, this offensive, called Operation Typhoon that we are going to see below, was the most important of the entire 1941 campaign, and even of the entire Second World War. The armies leading this offensive were Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army, which attacked north of Vyazma at the height of Moscow, Hobner's 4th Panzer Army, which attacked south of Vyazma, and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, which attacked much further south, between Kursk and Bryansk. Although these units were the spearheads of the German army, the 2nd, 4th and 9th armies also joined this attack. It should be noted that the different panzer divisions were far from being at 100%, and they were quite worn out after 3 months of combat, in which they had barely received reinforcements to cover their losses. For their part, the Soviets were also in a rather unfavorable situation after having lost millions of soldiers in recent months, and they were mobilizing new units at full speed to create new defensive lines. Despite the fact that the entire front line was threatened, it was in the vicinity of Moscow where they concentrated most of their troops so as not to lose their capital. The German attack began overwhelmingly, as was customary in those early years of the conflict. In barely a week, the 3rd and 4th Panzer Army surrounded 4 Soviet armies in Vyazma, some 200 kilometers from Moscow. Further south, the 2nd Army, together with Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, encircled 2 other Soviet armies at Bryansk. In total, more than 600,000 Red Army soldiers were once again taken prisoner by the Germans. Before this new great victory that they had obtained over their enemy, everything seemed to have ended, and the advance towards Moscow was expected as a simple walk. However, it was not. Despite having lost a third of their troops in just 1 week, the rest of the Red Army was able to retreat to Moscow and delay the German advance as best they could. In any case, the tension in Moscow was increasing and the security of the Soviet government was increasingly threatened. On October 16, the Soviet government decided, for security reasons in the face of the relentless German advance on its territory, to move the capital of the country from Moscow to Kyiv, on the banks of the Volga. The meeting also decided to place explosives in factories, bridges, railways, and even the Moscow metro, in anticipation of the Red Army being forced into urban combat. A little later, on October 19, a state of siege was declared and Beria brought in several NKVD regiments to restore order by force. Thus, the alarmists and anyone who had participated in a defeatist riot were shot. Meanwhile, the German vanguards continued advancing on Moscow, albeit at a slower pace. Their supply lines were stretched out and on the brink of collapse. In addition, the autumn rains began during the last days of the month, and the roads became muddy, making the German advance more difficult. Even so, by the end of October, the Germans established their front line just 80 kilometers from Moscow, and their new plan was to launch a new pincer offensive that would encircle the city. It was at this time when the Germans were regrouping to launch their final offensive, when on November 6, the first frosts began, announcing that the harsh Russian winter was about to fall. However, this was partly positive for the Germans as it hardened the mud and allowed for proper road traffic. On the other hand, many soldiers began to lose their lives due to freezing parts of their bodies, so it was clear that the operation had to end as soon as possible. General Zhukov had arrived in Moscow from Leningrad at the end of October, and was now in command of the city's defense. After mobilizing hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians, he had managed to build up to 3 defensive lines around the city, with which he hoped to stop the Germans. In an attempt to raise morale as much as possible to better face the combat that was to come, Stalin organized a parade in Moscow in which the units that had arrived from Siberia fully equipped participated, among others. In addition, Stalin gave a speech in which he made it clear that he had stayed in the city, to share his fate with that of all the soldiers and civilians in Moscow, and said that victory over the Germans was going to happen imminently. This being the situation, the new German offensive began on November 17. This time, 3rd Panzer Army would attack north of Moscow, 4th Panzer Army would charge frontally into the city, and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army would charge from the south. The German advance lasted until December 5, this being the moment in which the Red Army began its counteroffensive. In any case, during these almost 20 days of advance in which the extreme weather conditions had already made an appearance, the 3rd Panzer Army was able to position itself only 30 or 40 kilometers from Moscow. On the other hand, Guderian had achieved a great break in the Soviet front, and by December 5 he was already very close to Ryazan. However, he was almost 170 kilometers southeast of Moscow. At the same time as this was taking place, further south at Rostov, the German army suffered its first major setback of the entire campaign, and this set off all the alarm bells. So much so, that Hitler himself appeared on the southeastern front, to ask for explanations about what was happening, and that he did not believe possible. This took place on December 3 and cost Field Marshal Rundstedt his dismissal. While this crisis could be resolved by going back a bit, the worst was yet to come. It was specifically on December 5 when the Soviets began their great counteroffensive in Moscow, completely ending the last German hopes of ending the war on the Eastern Front. In any case, even if this strong counteroffensive had not taken place, it was clear that the exhausted German armies were not going to be able to complete the encirclement of Moscow, nor would they be able to enter the city during that harsh month of December. However, this counteroffensive brought with it a clear message that Hitler's headquarters had not wanted to accept. This news was that the Red Army was far from exhausted, and therefore defeated, and that its military capacity to continue launching offensives with hundreds of thousands of soldiers was still at full capacity. The first phase of the Soviet offensive consisted of attacking the German vanguards both to the north and to the south of Moscow, the troops being launched against Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army being more numerous. A few days later, other armies that were just to the west of Moscow also began strong offensives against the 4th Panzer Army that was protecting the sector. Faced with these attacks that took place on December 5, 1941, and on January 7 of the following year, the Germans could not do anything but retreat. The German units that were already in static mode in front of Moscow were the ones that withstood the Soviet onslaught the most, but the 3rd and 2nd Panzer armies, which were taken on the wrong foot, completely sank. This caused a large salient in the central sector of the Eastern Front during that first week of 1942, which threatened to pocket hundreds of thousands of German soldiers around Vyazma. For their part, the Germans had received orders not to retreat a single meter at the front, but it was clear that the Soviet threat was so strong that it could not be ignored. Thus, the Soviet attack with the objective of pocketing the German armies that were located in front of Moscow began on December 7, and managed to make a great penetration through the city of Rzhev and through Ostashkov. On the other hand, the southern pincer in the vicinity of Kaluga also advanced, although it did so at a slower pace. However, by the end of the month, the situation became very critical for the Germans when the two frontal breakouts that the Soviets had made northwest of Moscow came together, and began to advance towards Smolensko. At the same time, the southernmost German defenses were also crumbling. By mid-February, it can be said that the vast majority of German troops that 3 months earlier had participated in the final assault against Moscow were practically surrounded in a large rectangular pocket, near the vicinity of Vyazma. And it is that, to tell the truth, it barely connected by 2 small corridors with the rest of the units of the Center Army Group. As we can see on the map, by the beginning of March the central sector of the Eastern Front was a real headache, in which something similar to a German double horn was inserted in the Soviet lines. However, despite everything, the Germans were finally able to consolidate their defensive lines, and there was no further setback in the months that followed. As soon as spring arrived, they were able to reduce the Soviet troops that had been isolated in their rear, and also cut off the Soviet salient that practically reached Vyazma. From there, the Soviets launched a series of offensives that would become known as the Battles of Rzhev. Thus, the new German front line was located approximately 150 kilometers from Moscow, and it remained so until at the beginning of 1943, when Model had to abandon said salient to send troops to the fighting that was taking place around Kharkov. Although the Germans led the Soviets to believe that in the summer of 1942 they would launch an attack on Moscow again, the truth is that there was no new attempt to assault the capital of the Soviet Union. It is estimated that this great battle for Moscow that runs from the end of September 1941 to February 1942, caused some 400,000 casualties for Germany and just over 1 million for the Red Army. Despite the fact that this battle is not as attractive or widespread as that of Stalingrad or Kursk, it was undoubtedly the key battle of World War II, and its outcome marked all future actions. Well, I sincerely hope you liked this program. If you want to see how the huge Mars operation that the Soviets launched against this Rzhev salient was like, I leave you the program in the description, along with Carlos Caballero Jurado's, in which we saw the entire evolution of Barbarossa. Thank you all for being part of this community, and especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and we'll see each other here as always, next Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.